Imagine an army so unstoppable it crushed everything in its path. Europe trembled in 1241. Towns burned, kings fled, armies shattered. At Legnica and Mohi, entire nations faced annihilation. But then, they vanished. One death, one decision, and Europe was spared. What really happened? Cover the story history almost forgot, before it's too late. Europe in the early 13th century was a land of kingdoms, duchies, and fragile alliances. Castles dotted the landscape, towns buzzed with merchants and artisans, and the ruling elite maneuvered through politics, wars, and dynastic marriages. For most Europeans, the world beyond their borders was a distant, abstract concept. Few could imagine that a force from the vast plains of Asia was slowly moving westward, an unstoppable army unlike anything the continent had ever seen. This was the Mongol horde. Under the brilliant and ruthless command of Batu Khan and the legendary strategist Sübedei, the Mongols had already swept across Asia like a storm. Entire cities had fallen, populations decimated, and tales of their speed and cruelty had spread far and wide. Europe, however, had felt somewhat insulated, separated by geography, culture, and the perceived strength of its feudal armies. But that sense of safety was about to shatter. In 1241, Europe received its first brutal taste of the Mongol advance. The Mongols crossed the Carpathian Mountains, moving into Hungary and Poland. Their army was unlike any European force. Highly mobile cavalry, expert archers, disciplined formations, and an intelligence network that allowed them to strike where their enemies were weakest. The speed of their advance was terrifying. Whole armies found themselves outmaneuvered, towns burned before reinforcements could arrive, and panic spread like wildfire. The first major confrontation came at Legnica in Poland. The European forces, led by Duke Henry Roman II of Silesia, gathered a coalition of knights, mercenaries, and infantry. They were confident, trained in the conventional warfare of Europe, heavy cavalry charges, fortified positions, and rigid formations. But the Mongols did not fight like the armies they had faced before. They used deception, feigned retreats, and lightning, fast attacks to disorient their enemies. Within hours, the Polish-led army was decimated. Duke Henry himself fell in battle, his forces annihilated. Survivors would flee to warn neighboring kingdoms of the oncoming storm. Meanwhile, in Hungary, the Mongols pressed onward. King Beler Roman IV marshaled every available force to defend his kingdom, but the Mongols struck with devastating precision at the Battle of Mohi on April 11, 1241. The Hungarian army, larger than the Polish forces at Legnica, believed that numbers would be enough. But the Mongols' tactical genius turned the battle into a massacre. They encircled the Hungarians, used psychological warfare, and exploited the terrain with deadly effectiveness. By the end of the day, thousands lay dead, the Hungarian army broken, and the heart of the kingdom exposed. Cities were not spared. Villages and towns were razed, civilians slaughtered or enslaved, and the very fabric of society trembled. In Esztergom, the royal seat, the Mongols captured fortifications thought to be impregnable. Panic spread not just in Hungary and Poland, but across Central Europe. Messengers carried the terrifying news to Vienna, Prague, and even further west. Europe, for the first time in living memory, faced a force that seemed unstoppable, a horde that could sweep the continent into oblivion. The psychological impact was immense. Nobles debated fleeing, peasants prayed for deliverance, and chroniclers described the Mongols as agents of divine punishment. Rumors painted them as supernatural, invincible, and merciless. For the first time, Europe confronted the reality that its armies, castles, and alliances might not be enough to stop this new enemy, And yet, just as quickly as the Mongols had arrived, they withdrew. In 1242, the horde turned eastward, leaving devastation in its wake but sparing Europe from total conquest. Historians debate the reasons: the death of Sübedei Khan, logistical challenges, harsh winters, or perhaps the scale of destruction itself, making further occupation impractical. Whatever the reason, the withdrawal saved Europe from a catastrophe that could have reshaped its history forever. The events of 1241–1242 left an indelible mark on Europe. Kingdoms rebuilt, armies reformed, and lessons were learned. But the memory of the Mongol advance lingered. It was a stark reminder that even the mightiest civilizations could face extinction if unprepared for an enemy unlike any before. For a brief moment in history, Europe truly almost fell. As winter gave way to the early months of 1241, a shadow stretched across Europe. It was not a shadow of clouds or nightfall, but the ominous advance of the Mongol horde. Europe, confident in its fortified cities, armored knights, and long-standing military traditions, had never encountered anything remotely like this force. What made the Mongols truly terrifying was not merely their size, but their strategy, mobility, and sheer unpredictability. The Mongols did not rely on static defenses or conventional siege tactics. They were nomads, masters of the horse, able to traverse hundreds of miles with speed that European armies could not match. Each Mongol soldier carried a bow, a sword, and often multiple horses, allowing them to strike quickly and retreat before the enemy could respond. Their communication system, the famed Yam relay, ensured that intelligence about enemy positions, terrain, and reinforcements flowed faster than anyone in Europe could imagine. Every village they approached became a test of speed, coordination, and terror. The first major confrontation that would shake the European imagination was the Battle of Legnica, fought on April 9, 1241. Duke Henry Roman II of Silesia led a coalition of Polish knights and European mercenaries, hoping to halt the Mongol advance. They believed in their heavy cavalry, the armored knights whose very charge had once decided battles, but the Mongols had studied European warfare in depth. Sübedei, the brilliant tactician behind the invasion, understood the psychology and formations of European knights. Using feigned retreats, the Mongols drew the Polish forces into traps. Cavalry units that seemed to flee suddenly turned, encircling the pursuers. Arrows rained from a distance, unrelenting and precise. Within hours, the coalition army was shattered. Duke Henry Roman II fell, his body among thousands of casualties. Survivors scattered, sending warnings to neighboring kingdoms of the Mongol menace. Meanwhile, Hungary braced for impact. King Belar Roman IV knew that if Hungary fell, the path to the rest of Europe would be open. The Hungarian army gathered at the Battle of Mohai on April 11, 1241, numbering tens of thousands, confident that sheer numbers could withstand the Mongol storm. Yet confidence quickly turned to horror. The Mongols unleashed a coordinated assault, surrounding the Hungarian forces with terrifying precision. Rivers and terrain were manipulated to the Mongols' advantage. Dikes and streams were breached to flood key areas, trapping soldiers. Arrows from horseback decimated infantry, while Mongol cavalry flanked and attacked relentlessly. Panic spread through the ranks. By the end of the day, the Hungarian army was obliterated. Tens of thousands lay dead, and the kingdom's heart lay exposed to further invasion. The Mongols did not stop at battlefields. Towns, villages, and fortresses were systematically destroyed. Esztergom, the royal seat, fell despite its fortifications. Civilians who survived massacres were enslaved, and the psychological impact was immense. Entire regions were depopulated. Survivors would later describe the Mongols as supernatural, invincible, relentless, and merciless. Letters, chronicles, and tales traveled far, spreading fear to Vienna, Prague, and beyond. Europe, a continent used to conflict, now faced something it could not comprehend. But the Mongols were not reckless. Their strategy was one of both terror and calculation. They aimed to destabilize kingdoms, destroy military capabilities, and force submission. Cities that resisted were razed. Those that surrendered sometimes survived. Their mobility allowed them to strike where the enemy least expected. Armies attempting to regroup were intercepted, supply lines cut, and reinforcements slaughtered. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical. Fear and confusion spread faster than the Mongol army itself, paralyzing leaders who might have organized resistance. For weeks, Europe seemed on the brink. Kingdoms that had never faced such a foe scrambled to understand the threat. Monarchs debated fleeing to distant castles, peasants abandoned villages, and chronicles described the Mongols as agents of divine wrath. Europe had never encountered a combination of speed, intelligence, discipline, and brutality on this scale. The continent's traditional strength, armored knights, fortified castles, feudal levies, were proving ineffective against this unprecedented enemy. And yet, after months of destruction and terror, the Mongols did the unthinkable. They withdrew. In 1242, the horde suddenly turned eastward, leaving devastated lands behind but sparing the rest of Europe from complete conquest. Historians have long debated why. One of the most commonly cited reasons is the death of Sübedei Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire. Mongol custom required the princes and generals to return to the heart of the empire to elect a new leader. Others argue logistical challenges played a role. Horses needed grazing lands, and sustaining the army in devastated Hungary was untenable. Some suggest that the scale of destruction left little for the Mongols to conquer, an ironic, catastrophic success. Whatever the reason, Europe narrowly escaped total annihilation. The withdrawal left Europe reeling but alive. Kingdoms had been shattered, armies destroyed, and cities razed, but the continent had survived. King Roman IV would rebuild Hungary, fortifying cities and creating a more centralized defense. Poland, devastated at Legnica, slowly recovered. The lessons learned from this near extinction shaped European military thinking for decades. Mobility, intelligence, and coordination became critical. Europe had glimpsed the edge of annihilation and had survived, but it would not forget. The events of 1241-1242 serve as a reminder that history is not linear, and the survival of civilizations can hinge on a single moment. Europe, with all its castles, knights, and armies, had faced an enemy that seemed unstoppable. One battle, one strategic withdrawal, and the Mongol threat vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. For the people who lived through it, and for future generations reading their chronicles, the Mongol invasion of Central Europe was nothing short of apocalyptic. When the Mongols finally withdrew in 1242, Europe was left scarred, terrified, and transformed. Entire regions of Hungary and Poland lay in ruin. Towns had been burned to the ground, farms abandoned, and thousands of civilians killed or enslaved. Survivors wandered through smoldering villages, their livelihoods destroyed, trying to comprehend how an army from the Far East could have struck so swiftly and so completely. The devastation was both physical and psychological. the very idea that Europe was invulnerable had been shattered. In Hungary, King Bela Roman IV emerged from the catastrophe determined to rebuild. He became known as the second founder of Hungary for his relentless efforts to reconstruct the kingdom. Castles and fortresses were strengthened, towns were relocated to safer, more defensible locations, and new defensive strategies were implemented. Bela recognized that relying on traditional feudal levies was no longer sufficient. The Mongol invasion had shown that mobility, speed, and intelligence could render numbers meaningless. This realization fundamentally changed the military and political landscape of Central Europe. Poland, too, faced the long task of recovery. The Battle of Legnica had decimated its nobility and military, leaving the region vulnerable to further attacks. Surviving leaders organized reconstruction efforts, fortifying towns and ensuring better coordination among local armies. Chronicles written in the years following the Mongol withdrawal often emphasize the collective trauma, the near-apocalyptic fear that gripped the people, and the profound awareness of Europe's vulnerability. These accounts, filled with vivid descriptions of burning villages and unstoppable horsemen, became lessons for future generations. But Europe did not merely rebuild, it adapted. The Mongol threat had forced kingdoms to rethink defense, logistics, and intelligence. Armies became more flexible, emphasizing cavalry mobility and scouting. Fortifications improved, with towns surrounded by walls, gates, and towers designed to withstand prolonged sieges. Trade routes were reconsidered, and diplomacy with distant powers gained importance as rulers sought alliances to guard against potential invasions. The Mongol invasion had been a harsh teacher, and Europe took its lessons seriously. The long-term psychological impact of the Mongol threat cannot be overstated. For decades, chroniclers, historians, and storytellers referred to the events of 1002, 141-1002, 142 with a mixture of fear and awe. Tales of Mongol archers raining arrows from horseback, of armies encircled and annihilated, became part of European folklore. The image of the Mongols as both terrifying and unstoppable entered the collective imagination. Leaders, from monarchs to local lords, were reminded that Europe's strength was not guaranteed. It had to be maintained, prepared, and defended. Interestingly, the Mongols' withdrawal also created a historical paradox. Europe survived, yet the devastation left lasting scars. Some regions never fully recovered their populations for decades, and the economic disruption slowed the growth of towns and commerce. However, the memory of survival also instilled a sense of resilience. Communities rebuilt stronger, armies trained better, and political structures adapted to the harsh lessons of history. Europe had faced annihilation and survived. The Mongol invasion also left a subtle, long-lasting influence on European military thought. Observers marveled at the Mongols' use of intelligence networks, rapid communication, and highly mobile cavalry units. This awareness gradually influenced European tactics and strategy, even if direct imitation was limited. The very fact that a foreign army could challenge Europe's knights and fortified cities sparked innovations that would echo for centuries in military history. In a broader sense, the events of 1002, 141-1002, 142 remind us of the fragility of civilizations. Europe's survival hinged on factors that could easily have gone the other way: the death of a distant Khan, logistical limitations, and the Mongols' strategic decision to withdraw. At any moment, history could have unfolded differently, and Europe might have been conquered, reshaping the entire continent. For historians and storytellers, this episode is a powerful what-if scenario, a reminder that even the strongest powers are vulnerable to unforeseen threats. By the mid-13th century, Europe had absorbed the lessons of the Mongol invasion. Fortifications, military reforms, and political alliances strengthened kingdoms across the continent. Trade resumed, towns were rebuilt, and the trauma slowly gave way to resilience and adaptation. Yet the shadow of 1241-1242 lingered. Europe had looked into the abyss and lived, forever changed by the experience. In the end, the Mongol invasion of Central Europe stands as a testament to the thin line between survival and catastrophe. One army, one strategy, one moment in history had brought the continent to the brink, and yet, through a combination of circumstance, adaptation, and sheer fortune, Europe endured. The story of 1241-1242 is not just one of destruction and terror. It is a story of resilience, recovery, and the enduring spirit of civilizations facing unimaginable threats. History is often remembered by the victories and triumphs of great powers, yet sometimes it is defined by the moments when survival itself was in question. The Mongol invasion of 1241-1242 is one of those moments. In less than a year, Europe faced an enemy so swift, so ruthless, and so strategically brilliant that it seemed unstoppable. Armies were crushed, cities burned, and entire regions of Central Europe lay in ruins. For the first time, the continent realized that its castles, knights, and armies were not invincible, that even the strongest civilizations could teeter on the brink of annihilation. The stories of Legnica and Mohyj are etched into history as reminders of this terrifying reality. At Legnica, Polish forces were outmaneuvered and destroyed. At Mohyj, the Hungarian army, despite its size and determination, could not withstand the Mongol onslaught. Towns and villages were engulfed in fire, survivors fled in desperation, and panic spread across kingdoms. Europe, in those months, was not merely under threat. It was exposed, vulnerable, and facing what could have been a complete collapse of its civilization. Yet, against all odds, Europe survived. The sudden withdrawal of the Mongols, influenced by factors both political and logistical, spared the continent from conquest. The destruction they left behind was immense, but it was not the end. Europe rebuilt, stronger and wiser. Kings and rulers fortified cities, reformed armies, and learned that mobility, intelligence, and preparation could turn the tide against even the most formidable adversaries. The lessons of 1241-1242 would echo through centuries, shaping military strategy, fortification design, and the very way societies perceived threats from beyond their borders. The Mongol invasion also serves as a powerful reminder of the fragility and resilience of civilizations. One death, one decision, one unforeseen circumstance. These were enough to alter the course of history. Europe almost fell, yet it endured, adapted, and emerged with a renewed sense of purpose. It is a story of near catastrophe transformed into survival, a testament to the human capacity to rebuild and persevere even after unimaginable devastation. For us today, the events of 1241-1242 are more than a historical footnote. They are a lesson in perspective. They remind us that security is never guaranteed, that vigilance and adaptability are essential, and that even in the face of overwhelming odds, resilience can define the fate of nations. The Mongols may have brought fear and destruction, But Europe's survival is a testament to determination, courage, and the unpredictable twists of history. In the end, the day Europe almost fell is not just a story of armies and battles. It is a story of survival against all odds, a stark warning and an inspiring lesson. Europe stood at the edge of annihilation and stepped back, forever changed, forever aware of the thin line between collapse and continuation. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring legacy of 1241-1242, a world forever reminded that history is fragile and that survival is never guaranteed. But with courage, adaptability, and resilience, even the darkest moments can be overcome.